Okay, welcome back. In the previous video, we took care of item rarity by showing different numbers of stars based on the item rarity property that we can set in the blueprint. Now, in this video, we're going to create a variable for the equipped weapon for our character and use that to determine which weapon she's holding. Let's take a look at the Bellica folder by going to Paragon, Lieutenant Bellica, Characters, Heroes, Bellica, and Meshes, and double click on Bellica. Now we'll see that Bellica has a gun as part of her mesh, and the materials for the gun are the element 4 in her material slots. Now, rather than just let her mesh handle the gun, we want to handle which gun she has in her hands at any given point in time. So we're going to go ahead and take her Bellica Guns material for element 4 of her materials, and we're going to set that to transparent. Remember, we made a material called transparent. Now, if we select that, all of a sudden her gun on her mesh will be invisible. We will no longer see her gun. So go ahead and click Save and close the Bellica mesh, and now if we hit play, we'll be able to see that she's not holding a gun anymore. It's now up to us to determine which weapon she'll be holding. That's great because now we can swap out those weapons, which we'll do later in this course. Okay, so let's go ahead and take care of spawning a weapon and assigning that to her equipped weapon. So let's get started. So we're here in shooter character.h, and I'm going to add a new variable in the private variables section. So here's our private section. I'm going to scroll down and create a new variable, and it's going to be an A weapon, and this will be called equipped weapon. So let's forward declare this and do an A weapon pointer called equipped weapon. And this variable will hold the currently equipped weapon at any point in time in the game. Let's give it a U property. And we want to be able to set this only in C++. So let's make this visible anywhere. We'll make this blueprint read only. And for category, let's put this in a category called combat. Now, we'll need the meta specifier, so we'll put that in there. And now we have a equipped weapon variable. For the comment, let's say currently equipped weapon. Now we're going to want to give her a default weapon that she'll start the game with. So we don't want her to have to go and find a weapon. We want to give her something that she can have equipped automatically. Now to spawn something, we need a U class, which is a variable that holds a reference to a blueprint. If we want a U class that we can set in a dropdown in the blueprints, we can use T subclass of. Now T subclass of requires a type, and we're going to use a weapon. And we're going to call this the default weapon class. So this is a variable that we're going to set in blueprints to choose which weapon we're going to use for this variable. We're going to give this a U property. We're going to make this edit defaults only, so we can only set this in the details panel in the blueprint. Let's make this blueprint read only. And I'm going to put this in category combat and give it the meta specifier. So let's give this a comment, and we'll say set this in blueprints for the default weapon class. So we're going to spawn a new weapon based on the value that we hold in this variable here. So we'll create a function to spawn and equip the default weapon. We'll create this in the protected section. It'll be a void function, and we'll call this spawn default weapon. So let's give this a function body, and here in this function we'll spawn the default weapon and put it on our character. We'll attach it to the character. Now in order to attach a weapon to our character mesh, we need to add a socket to her skeleton. We're back in the editor, And I'm going to the meshes folder here in Lieutenant Bellica. Now here is Bellica, and here's Bellica's skeleton. It's the skeleton that she uses. I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to type hand, and we'll see here we have this hand R bone that corresponds to this bone right here on her mesh. We're going to add a socket to this hand R bone. So let's right click and add socket. And we're going to rename this socket, and we'll call this right hand socket. So now we have a socket here, and we can add a preview asset to this socket to show what it would look like if we attached a mesh to it. We can do that by taking the right hand socket here, right clicking and add preview asset. And we can select a mesh. Click in search assets and search for Bellica _ guns. And this gives us the guns mesh. And here we have the gun. Now notice it's not oriented correctly, so we can rotate this. I'm going to rotate it by 90 degrees, and I'm also going to move it forward until it looks like it's in the correct position. So this will take some adjusting until you get it just right, but we want this to look like she's holding it. So this will involve moving it, rotating it, maybe turning off snapping so that we can get this looking just right. We want her finger just about on the trigger here. And we want the handle seated right there in her hand. Okay, that looks okay, but we may have to come back here and tweak this. The way we can check is by going to an animation. So let's click here on animation, and here we can see her running animation. We can zoom in, and we can come down here and pause the animation to take a look and see how it looks. And it seems to look okay. Her finger's on the trigger, she's holding the weapon, everything looks correct. So if yours doesn't look correct, go back to the skeleton and adjust the position of the right hand socket until it looks okay. Okay, so we now have a socket called right hand socket. Back here in shooterCharacter.cpp, we're going to spawn the weapon. Now remember, we created these variables in shooterCharacter.h called equipped weapon and default weapon class. Default weapon class is a T subclass of that we're going to set to a blueprint in the shooter character blueprint. Now in shooterCharacter.cpp, we're first going to check to see if default weapon class is valid. In other words, if we haven't set this on the blueprint, then this will be null. And we can't spawn an item based on this if it's null. So next we're going to spawn an item. We're going to create a local variable of type a weapon pointer called default weapon. And we're going to spawn a weapon using getWorld spawn actor. This is a function that can spawn an actor, and it requires you to specify the type. We're going to specify a weapon. Now, when we spawn an actor, we can provide it with a uClass, that's a variable that holds a blueprint, or we can spawn a static class, which is basically spawning from the raw C++ class. We want to spawn based on a blueprint, so we're going to use the default weapon class. That's the T subclass of variable we created that we're going to set on the shooter character blueprint. So once we've spawned this weapon, we're storing it in this default weapon variable. So next, we're going to attach it to the socket we just created. We're going to create a const uSkeletal mesh socket. We're going to call this hand socket, and we're going to set it equal to that socket that we're going to get from the mesh. So we can get the mesh by calling getMesh, and from the mesh we're going to use a function called getSocketByName. This takes an fname, and we're going to use the name of the socket we created, which we called right hand socket. So now we have a variable called handSocket, and that's of type useSkeletalMeshSocket. So now all we need to do is check to make sure that that handSocket is valid. And if so, we can attach our weapon to it. So we're going to say handSocket attach actor. An attach actor requires an actor. We're going to attach our newly spawned weapon called default weapon. An attach actor also requires a skeletal mesh component, and we're of course going to use the mesh of our character. So we're going to use get mesh to get that mesh. Now we're seeing an error regarding the A weapon type. That's because we need to include the A weapon type header. So go up to the top and let's include weapon.h. So now we can come back down and we'll see that there is no error here. So for our first comment here, we're going to say check the T subclass of variable. That's checking default weapon class. Next, we actually spawn the weapon. Then we get the handSocket. And finally, if the handSocket is valid, then we attach the weapon to the hand. Attach the weapon to the hand socket. Right hand socket. So this function spawns the weapon and attaches it to the socket on our mesh. So we simply need to call this, and we can call this in begin play, so our character will have a weapon from the start of the game. So let's search for begin play, and just under the if follow camera check, we'll call spawn default weapon, and we can give this a comment saying spawn the default weapon and attach it to the mesh. Perfect. Let's go ahead and compile this. Okay, so back in the editor, the last thing we need to do is go to our character blueprint. So let's go to game, character, and shooter character BP. And I'll open the full blueprint editor. And I'm going to search for default weapon class. Here's our T subclass of variable default weapon class, and we can select it here. So I'm going to click the drop down. Now I want you to notice something. When we created this T subclass of variable, we specified the weapon class, a weapon. Here it is in shooter_character.h. It's T subclass of a weapon. But while we're selecting it here in the blueprint, we can choose weapon or base weapon BP, and that's because base weapon BP is derived from weapon, and that's why this is called T subclass of. You specify a class and you can set the variable to that class, or you can set it to anything derived from that class, right? A subclass of that class. And so we're going to select base weapon BP. Now by doing so, this variable default weapon class now holds a reference to base weapon BP, but the beauty of it is this is a C++ variable. We have it here in C++, and it now holds a reference to a blueprint. So here in spawn default weapon, we're checking to see if that's valid, and then we're spawning an actor based on the value that we set in the blueprint. In other words, based on base weapon BP. Okay, so we can compile and save this. And as we press play, we'll notice now that there's a weapon in her hands, but this is not the weapon that belongs to her mesh. Remember, that weapon is hidden. We set the material to transparent for that one. This is actually an object of type base weapon BP. I'm going to hit Shift F1 to get control of the mouse and search for base weapon BP. And I can see here, here's our shooter character, and attached to it is base weapon. And that's the base weapon BP class. Excellent. Now lastly, in spawn default weapon, we have our default weapon that we spawned, and we can now set the currently equipped weapon, which we created a variable for, equipped weapon, equal to this default weapon that we've spawned. So we'll set that down here. We'll say equipped weapon equals default weapon. and we'll comment this and say set equipped weapon to the newly spawned weapon. Okay, so go ahead and compile, and that will conclude this video. In the next video, we're going to create an equip function that will handle all of this stuff, so that way we don't have it just tied to spawn default weapon. We're going to have a function that can equip any weapon, so we can have other weapons in the world and equip those to our character. So we'll see you in the next video.